you, Alan. So thanks for coming tonight. We wanted to give you a little bit of introduction about Access, and specifically I will be talking about some of the design decisions that we made along the way, some of the things that we learned as a team, and also some of the feedback that we provide back to the Cocktails platform. We will talk a little bit more about that. So I wanted to start with Access. Codename was SearchX, so it's still we are trying to change our mind and the name, so maybe I will mention SearchX along the way. So personally, I have a lot of fun creating this application and this product. I think the team in general enjoy a lot being able to work on a project that from day one, it was set to be deployed for mobile application. So it's kind of being able to deploy these into different types of screens and so on. So for our team, it was the first time to work on such a project, that kind of project, and changing this mentality into more like mobile first. So it was kind of fun. In general, we learned a lot during the last year. So it took around a year to pull all this together. So from day one of the things that we wanted to do is to avoid using any kind of desktop like framework or frameworks that were meant to be used in desktop or created for desktop application, because we wanted to create a mobile application. So it's kind of difficult to start using a technology that already have a huge technical debt when you look at it from the mobile perspective. Imagine that you try to just reuse whatever we have in search, and we have a lot of technology there, we have a lot of platform and pieces that we can potentially reuse, but using those pieces means that we are going to start from scratch, having a huge technical debt from the mobile point of view. So it's kind of difficult to start from that perspective. So we wanted to start from scratch, but also looking into mobile platforms and mobile products that were built at Yahoo or outside Yahoo to try to use the technology that suits the most for this kind of product. So we decided to get involved with the cocktail folks that are around there. And we started looking into the cocktail umbrella. So as Ren mentioned, cocktails is not a product, it's not a project, it's a set of products and platforms that you can use to create these mobile applications. So let's talk a little bit more about cocktails and some of the products and platforms that they offer today, and also the fact that Cocktails is becoming the de facto platform for mobile application at Yahoo and hopefully outside Yahoo in the near future. So as part of the Cocktail umbrella, the first project that is probably more close to our area is the Mojito application framework. It's a JavaScript application framework. And it was built on top of YUI. At Yahoo, we all in the front-end engineer area, we all use YUI for a long time, and we have been evolving at the same time that the library has been evolving. So we know a lot of stuff about YUI. We are comfortable using YUI in our project, so it was kind of easy for us to just go that way because of that single thing. But not only that, it also used Node.js as the platform to run Mojito application in the server side, and we will talk a little bit more about that. But you know, Mojito or Node.js is a new technology. It's fun to use. People really enjoy to hack into it, and in general, it has a lot of potential to become a major platform in the future. So we really want to get into that kind of project where you use this kind of new technology, and also use Express to do pretty much the underlying serving for static assets and so on. So in general, it's a composition of open source projects. So the other project that is under the umbrella is Manhattan, and for now I will just say that Manhattan is just a hosting infrastructre for Node.js applications. And hopefully we can share more about Manhattan in the future. I will just give you a snap peek of what Manhattan looked like from the server side stack perspective. You just have Manhattan, some Node.js V8 to support the JavaScript that runs in the server, and then a bunch of other projects that are open source. We also add handlebars. We are in the process of adding handlebars there as well. And then you have the Mojito layer, and on top of that, you can put your application. So Cocktails is abstracting this area in the server side. Another project is the Mojito Shaker. We have Diego there, which is a static asset rollup manager for Mojito application. So you create this application, and when you get ready to put it into production, you use this Mojito Shaker to take care of all the hazard to get it ready for production. We're still working on it for Access. Hopefully, we can get it in production really soon. It is also open source, so you can go and get it. So let's get into the main subject, Access and the making of Access as a project. So one of the first things that we got into was this mythical proverb that you can write once and deploy it everywhere and so on. So we have been seeing that for a long time in other technologies and other infrastructures, which is very cool, but it's kind of difficult to get to that point where you can actually create a software that can be deployed everywhere without too much hazard. So from my perspective, make no mistake, there is no silver bullet in our industry today. And in other words, like, can you imagine like maybe a car that works exceptionally well under any conditions? It's kind of hard to imagine that. And maybe if you remove the exceptionally from there, so you get a car that works well, maybe. So it's kind of hard to imagine that kind of platform infrastructure without having to put a lot of effort just to configuring that piece of software to be able to run everywhere. So in the case of Access, what we did, we were trying to create a browser, or some sort of browser to be able to search and to have this search experience. We knew we have to use some native pieces because we need to control the loading process. We need to load application into our application, load web pages into our application. It's kind of silly to think that you will not use the native pieces to be able to enhance that browsing experience. So we knew we have to use some of those. So we decided to abandon this mentality of trying to create something that works everywhere, just like a web application. But we didn't want to just do it all native. As Ren mentioned, it's not even an option for us. It's too big, too painful to get to the point where you have multiple applications, different devices running natively. So what we did was basically do what we do best, divide. So we are very good at looking at, as a front end, you look at this kind of layout. This is a layout of Access. And when you look at it, the things that comes to your mind probably is, how can I split this thing into logical pieces? And that's the way that we think. So we did it. We split it into pieces, into logical pieces. But what if we think about those widgets or areas or web parts or whatever you want to call it? What did you think about that in terms of small independent pieces? And that was some sort of small applications. Imagine that this is a big application and you have small pieces in it. So And then you can just look into each individual piece and analyze them independently, not in the context of the whole application, but just in the context of that particular piece that you are trying to analyze. And that single twist changed the way that we approved this problem from the very beginning. So it was no longer black and white. It was no longer native versus web, or in general, it just became like multicolor choices. So we decided to go for a different approach. We just wanted to be able to combine the native and the HTML to bring the best experience for our users based on the capabilities of each different device. And eventually we get into a different type of question. And as you can see here, HTML5 application shipped as part of the iOS application that you put into the App Store, into the bundle, or HTML5 application that you load over the network. And you see I put a logo network activity at the top there. So it's kind of a different kind of beast. They are different. They're not the same. And you have to be able to differentiate and to try to understand what are the use cases that they can solve at any given time. So when we start looking at this and trying to analyze each individual piece in Access and trying to figure out which one is better for what we want to do, the answer was quite amazing for us. Mojito can produce both from the same source code. So it's basically, you have the ability to create this application, and eventually you have to decide you want to build it and put it into the bundle that you will put in the App Store, on the Android market, or any other application store, or you have the ability to just put it into your servers and serve it from there. So in other words, we have the option to defer that decision without actually impacting the design that you have initially. So that was quite a revelation for us. And basically, we decided to get a little bit more time to get our head around this concept, and eventually we make a decision. And the difference is just Mojito build versus Mojito start. And you can go into the documentation and look at it. It's really nice ways to produce different version of your application. So then, for each individual piece that I showed you before, we just have the question of deciding between using native layer or using HTML and put it into the bundle, or just creating an HTML application that runs over the network. That's a kind of decision that we have to make for each of the pieces that I highlight before. So on the same lines, another question came up, like, right, if we have all these individual pieces and they are really individual, how can we share logic between them? When we talk about sharing, we usually refer to reuse and reduce complexity. So you want to reduce the complexity of the software by reusing some of the pieces and trying to gather some of the logic into logical pieces. And usually, that means, in terms of reusing, that you have a lot of interdependencies, which is good in some cases, but some cases is not that good. The other thing is that reduce also means that you will zoom out rather than zoom in. And what I'm trying to say is that you are creating a software, you're creating individual pieces. These pieces have to be connected somehow. These pieces might have some shared logic, maybe the logging of the user information across all different applications or something like that. You rather have to spend a lot of time to trying to understand the whole software to be able to change a piece of it. And that's a limitation when you bring people on board, when you bring people to your project, how they can ramp up really fast. In Access and in Mojito, we follow the NPM approach, where each individual piece can control its own dependencies. So we don't want to have this kind of hard dependencies of coupling between different pieces. And Fabian will be talking more about that in one of the presentations today. So we also know that recycling, not so much. We just produce software, and eventually 2 years from now, someone else will come, they will change everything, and they will drop your code. Or maybe 3 years, maybe 5 years or so, but no more than that. So reuse, but in our case, we decided to reuse, but without coupling pieces. So we want to reuse some pieces, yeah. We will use NPM for that. We want to reduce the interdependencies and reduce the time to ramp up, not reduce the time to produce the final software. And the other, or the new word here is the replace. In our case, we really want to be able to produce this application called Access that is a composition of different applications, and at any given time, for any specific device, we can just change one of these applications, change a switch, and you have a new version of one of these components without affecting the rest. We don't want to spend time having all these connected applications or pieces that are hard to modify, in the sense that you have to have full knowledge of the whole stack to be able to change something. But how can we actually, how the hell are we going to connect all these so-called independent pieces? You have all these independent pieces, they have their own dependencies and so on. How can you connect them? The answer to that is y.cl, and Eugene will be talking more about it after this presentation. This is pretty much the structure that we use to connect all these pieces. It's pretty cool. It's open source already. He will be talking more about it. So I want to give you more details about this kind of HTML5 over the network kind of application. Some pros and cons on that. So the number one benefit of using this kind of application, and we use a lot of that in Access, is the ability to reduce the fragmentation. We know it is a big deal. We know when you ship your application to the App Store, you might end up having multiple versions of that application, and eventually you will have a huge legacy that you cannot just drop. And you cannot force your user to upgrade. So it's a big deal. It's a big deal for products that will change rapidly over time, and Access is one of that kind of projects. So, and you ultimately, all these fragmentation just gets reflected on testing and QA process, and you ended up having a product that is so big in terms of testing and QA process in general that you cannot move faster. You cannot move forward. So that's one of the things. The other thing is that you don't need to issue an update of your application. And it is a reality. People just don't update their application. They don't care about that. They don't know what bug fixing means. They just don't do it. You ended up having all these applications there. In Access, since we use that kind of application that I mentioned, we also have problems. This is not all good. One of the problems is that some of these web views that are running this application coming over the network might be there running for days. Users don't close the application. They just switch between apps. And even when you get into a plane, you just put plane mode. You don't close. You don't turn your phone off. So it's kind of difficult to control what is the version that your users are running and for how long they have been running that piece. So it's kind of difficult to manage that. So you might end up in this position where you also have different versions of your web application. Even when you think that you're safe, you are not. Another thing is that as front-end engineers, we know about the web. So it's easy for us just to ramp up in this kind of application. We know how to serve traffic. We know how to load HTML, CSS, JavaScript. We know how to optimize that. So it's kind of easy for us just to get used to this kind of application. For our team, mostly front-end engineers that have been working for quite some time doing web applications, it was more natural for us. Very important thing is, even for a small company, if your product is going to require a lot of experimentation, and you need, for example, segmenting the traffic that you are receiving, or maybe you want to produce different versions, you want to test new things, we are doing search. So it is a requirement from the product point of view, that we need to be able to test new things. We need to ship new features every week. We need to tweak pieces and see how they behave. So for us, it's kind of difficult to abandon the web. We already have a huge amount of tools and other kind of infrastructure just to analyze metrics and to be able to move forward in terms of testing and experimenting. So it is all about control. If you really need control, this kind of application is probably the best shot. So one of the big pains of this kind of application is the hazard to deal with the network and the network problems. So in this case, this is a snapshot of access. So you try to open it, you don't have a network connection, you might be getting this kind of loading icon, and it doesn't do much. If you don't control what the network connection, you might end up having bigger problems. So in our case, in Access, we have this registration process. So the web views that we load over the network, we don't have them visible. They are not visible. And whenever we know for sure that they are ready, then we make them visible. So that's one of the solutions that we use. This is another kind of, another problem that is very common today. You might, if you use an iPhone or an iPad, you might get into this situation where you have an application that is trying to load stuff over the network, and eventually one of them fails. So in this case, we all know what's going on here. The CSS is not loading. It fails to load. So in desktop and in a browser, a user knows how to fix this thing. They know there is a button there that they just click on it, refresh, and they're back in business. In an application, this is a little bit different. We don't have a reload button there. We cannot put a reload button in every single web view that we create. So it's kind of a pain to solve this kind of problem. In Access, what we are doing is part of the registration process also include a checklist. So we have maybe a CSS or something like that that will allow you to check the state of one of the elements, and you know if the element is really hidden or not, so you can know if the CSS is there or not. So in the same lines, we have this checklist that allows us to understand what's going on in that web view and even issue a reload if needed. If we feel that it's not ready, it's taking too much time, we can probably reload it. Another bad thing is that web views that load remote content, they are not first-class citizen in iOS. We have no Nitro, so it's a little bit slow compared with Safari. iOS can wipe out things without giving you a clue about it, so they can just wipe the local storage or the cache or whatever they want, depending on the condition of that device. So in Access, we work around some of these limitations, but it's pretty difficult. But until today, loading over the network is still the safer and easier way to load content and to have control over that content. Ideally, we will get Mojito support, and for this use case, and Satyan and Matt and other people at Yahoo are working hard to try to bundle these into Mojito and to try to be able to ship this HTML application into the App Store as part of the bundle, and being able to also go and get a new version of that application over the network in a zip file and just get it ready locally in the device. So it's kind of the way that we want to move forward. It is also very difficult because it's like a gray area, and Apple doesn't give you too much choice there. So the next topic is what we call optimization and adaptation or versus adaptation. So when using hybrid approach, like the one that we are using, having these native components and these HTML components, it kind of opened a door for adaptation and optimization. And Mojito is right on the money on these two subjects, in these two areas. Not too many frameworks are actually looking into these at the scale that Mojito is doing it. And I wanted to dig in a little bit more on that. So let me give you an analogy on that. You go and buy the car that you like, and you ask for the right tires for you, for your situation, for your location, and so on. So you get a car, you start driving, and you don't like the way it feels. Or maybe you are traveling, or maybe you are moving to different locations, so you might be having problems with it. What can you do? You already bought it, so you kind of stuck with it. So you might want to adjust the pressure of the tires. Maybe you can use a different kind of air depending on the situation. Maybe you just need to use snow chains, and that will keep you going depending on the conditions, so you change the way that your car behaves. So in Mojito, optimization is really, in Mojito in general, it really enables you to think about performance as a product feature. And the way it does is basically, in Mojito, optimizing is just about customizing the way that your product behaves per runtimes and per request, these two vectors, and we will talk a little bit more about that. It is about producing the right HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So you have this application that is coming over the network, you need to ship CSS, JavaScript, HTML to the client. And you have to do that per runtime, per request. And these are the two things that we know. We know about the request that comes in. We know about the situation where this application is running on a server that we control. So these are the two things that we can control. So in Mojito, you have multiple runtimes. And producing code for each runtime is not hard. You just need to follow some rules and some configuration here and there, but it's fairly easy to do it. But more important is the use of Mojito context. So this is the entry point for you to Mojito. You need to understand how the context works. So for example, we can, based on that request that comes in, based on that server that you're running on, we can give you like the local, maybe we can give you information about what kind of environment you're running on, what kind of device is this user using, based on the request information, what kind of runtime are you using, usually server, if you're running it over the network application. You can even go and do more customization and saying, yeah, I also want to know the network. I want to know if the user is running AT&T or Verizon because I want to brand my product based on the network that the user is running on. You can even have CPU information, memory information, because you control that server. You're running that application over the network. You can have all kind of configuration depending on your requirements. So in Mojito, you have to optimize per context. And optimizing per context means that you will producing, again, the best HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, depending on these two conditions, the request and the runtime. So let me give you an example real quick. This is a definition for one of our modules. So we are saying here that definition, master definition, which is the generic values, the default values. We have this configuration, this scroll view, and you probably saw in the video that you can just swipe in access to get more content. So we wanted to be able to customize the way that these scroll behave. And for those who have been using YUI scroll view, you probably know about these two properties. You have this acceleration and bounce. And what we have here is you have a default value, but we want to customize that value for mobile applications. We know that for mobile, the bouncing should be a little bit smaller because it feels better when you try it out. So in that case, we are just customizing this thing for a mobile device. Maybe we want to include some metas just for that kind of device and so on. So what you can see here is that you are abstracting part of the logic that you usually put into the software into the configuration of that software. And Mojito enables you to reduce the complexity of your code by relying on this multi-dimensional configuration computed automatically per request. I think this is new in the industry. Another example is what you do in an event on a traffic source. So you're getting a huge amount of traffic for whatever reason, social network, sending the links out there, you can get a pretty big amount of traffic just in a short period of time. So it is a hard problem. It is a hard problem that everyone has in the industry today. How can you solve it? You can put more money on it. You can just let them die. Eventually, the traffic source will finish and your server will come back eventually. You can degrade your servers. That's what we usually do at Yahoo. Or you can delegate some process to the client side. Let the client carry on this particular process. That's the kind of things that you can do in Mojito. I think no other framework out there allows you to have that kind of flexibility. So this is an example of that. So I have this master configuration that says that for every single request, by default, uses server-side rendering when we produce this content that you can scroll. So what we are doing is saying, hey, by the way, for mobile devices, don't do the rendering because we are rendering 30 cars in that search layer. But for mobile, you have only a small viewport, so you probably display only one. So we don't want to spend rendering 30 of them just when we can render one of them in the client side. But that's a general configuration. And on top of that, you can say, by the way, if my servers are running hot, make sure that you also render everything, delegating that rendering to the client side. That kind of stuff that you can do, kind of stuff that we use in Access today. And of course, you can control the dimension of your application. You have full control over what you can configure and what are the dimensions that you want to control and so on. One more example on that. This is the way that you define dimensions. Dimensions is a finite structure, and in the sense you just need to define what are the dimensions, the name of each of these dimensions, and what are the possible values that this dimension can have. Maybe you just want to know if the user is running on Verizon or AT&T. Maybe you just want to define the device that you will support. Maybe you will just want to include TV there. The other side of this subject is the adaptation. And adaptation, Mojito and YUI for the matter, really enables you to think about adaptability as a product feature. So how can we build an application that you ship into the web view, browser, or anything that runs a Mojito application in the client side, and how can this application can behave accordingly? So adaptation in Mojito is about customizing the UI per screen size, per connection speed, per feature detection, and so on. We have different capabilities in each of these devices. So it is about responsive UI. So in our case, for Axis, for example, we have more than 500 mocks and concepts. And you can see them distributed between different devices. And in general, iPad is a bigger one, the big one. But in general, as a product requirement, you have different interaction depending on the type of device that you are running on. So which means that you need to change even though you're trying to create or reuse code across all different screens, you have to customize that. You have to customize the behavior of that. So in Mojito, YUI covers a lot of, in terms of adaptation. So YUI already support conditional loading based on the capabilities of the device. So you just load cache offline. It doesn't matter if you don't have support for that, for local storage. Or you just click on it. It doesn't matter if it is a click or a touch or whatever it is, orientation change and so on. Maybe you just want to get a query from a different component, and Eugene will be talking more about that. So you can basically adapt per screen size. Maybe you use CSS media queries. Or you can just adapt per orientation or connection speed, and this one is interesting. You can basically monitor every time that you make a call to an API or something and check the latency, and eventually you can get a sense of what the speed, the connection speed for that particular user. What are you going to do with that? It all depends on your condition, of your software, but in our case, we might want to optimize the amount of requests that we make. Maybe we are going to call our server side saying, by the way, this user is running in 3G, make sure that you render pieces in the server side, mash them up, and send a single response. Stuff like that are doable in Mojito. Memory. iOS will give you warnings through the native layer, telling you, hey, you're running low in memory. Make sure that you clean something there. And the next warning is not a warning. It will just crash the app. So let's do a quick recap on some of these concepts. Axis is running on Yahoo cocktails. So it is all about cocktails. Even though we have some native pieces, it is in the context of cocktails. Axis is some kind of hybrid application. It's composed of independent small pieces that can be implemented in native or HTML. It all depends on what are the conditions and what we want to do with that particular device. We can even have different type of device running the native version or HTML version. It all depends on what we want to do, what we want to achieve. HTML5 parts were written on Yahoo Mojito. So all the HTML that we have is just Yahoo. It's just a Mojito application, different Mojito application, actually. It is open source. It's created on top of YUI and Node.js, so it's pretty good. Axis leverage Mojito context to be able to optimize and adapt those HTML pieces depending on the conditions, the request, the runtime, the device type, and so on. Axis also leveraged CL, and this is the communication layer that I mentioned before, as a main infrastructure to connect all these pieces, even if the pieces is just a native piece. So we have this infrastructure to be able to connect all together. And Eugene will be giving you a deep dive on that subject. Right, so this is all I have for today.